3:40 in the morning, in the Whitechapel district of London, a local carriage driver named Charles Cross stumbled upon a ghastly scene. Initially, he thought that he discovered a tarp lying on the ground in front of the entrance to a stable yard while traveling on the darkly lit streets, only, upon further investigation, to realize that it was the body of a woman. Gaining the aid of another late night worker named Robert Paul, the duo found that she was dead and went off to work, hoping to find an officer on the way as they were both very late to their jobs. However, another officer happened upon the body, and he began to rally other officers to help him with this newfound case of murder. Soon, the people of Whitechapel, of Britain, and of the whole world would begin to hear of a vicious killer who prowled the streets of London at night and savagely attacked his victims, creating a media frenzy and one of the world's oldest cold cases that to this day has not been definitively solved. Here we have one of the most compelling mysteries of history and true crime, and the beginning of the killings organized by the individual memorialized as Jack the Ripper, which we will be discussing tonight on Friday Night Frights. I'm your host, Christian Ashley of Systematic Geekology, here to terrify and instruct you all on the weird, unusual, fascinating, fantastical, and unexplainable things that may or may not lurk out there in the world. This one we know for sure. But who he is, that's the question. Now, just as a reminder, our schedule for all of this is to, once a month, cover one of 6 categories. This would be cryptozoology, the paranormal, religious strangeness, the weird and the unexplained, true crime, and ufology. Obviously, we're doing true crime right now with Jack the Ripper, so there you go. Now, important things to note before we head into the discussions of the cases and the victims and the police work done here is we've got to know what's going on in the world. Now, it's going to be a total overview of everything that was happening in London in 1888. It'll be enough. But before I actually do that, I do need to talk about something else. Now, obviously, we're talking about a brutal case here involving the deaths of several women, and that's something not everyone's up for. That's okay. I get it. So right now, here is your content warning. This is going to be a very unpleasant discussion in many ways. And I held back on a lot of this information, so I'm not going into graphic detail on a ton of stuff, but sometimes even mentioning that is enough for someone to be very upset. Once again, totally get it. It's not my favorite thing in the world to look at some of the photos I saw. Also, I was going to show some of them, but then I decided, nope, that's probably not the best. And I know other people probably wouldn't appreciate that. So, with that in mind, to get your head straight, like, hey, if this is something that you're not into, if this is a situation where you realize like all the victims of this situation are women, they were brutalized in various ways, and these women especially were seen as a far more expendable due to their professions, if that's something that you might not find interesting or entertaining or uplifting or worthwhile, then I would suggest, for your own good, stop watching right now. And I'll see you in December for another case to discuss. That'll be a little more lighthearted. There's still some gruesome stuff that happens to Betty and Barney Hill. Spoilers for what we're talking about in December, but it's not nearly as bad as this. So, if you're still around here, let's get into the goings on of London in 1888, just to help us understand the turmoil experienced by all involved in this case, from down low to officers to above. We've got to understand, how could this happen? What brings someone to this point? What are the possibilities? Because once again, we don't know the killer, so maybe some of this matters, some of this doesn't, to helping us understand a case. But for our sake, while Britain was glorified across the world as the empire where the sun never sets, which is not the first time that phrase has been used, but typically when people think of it, it's going to be the British Empire. While that's happening, anyone who probed into its darker sides would easily discover that this facade was no gift to those of lower class and wealth, as has pretty much been the case throughout history. And then, ever since the Industrial Revolution, the workforce had suffered immensely from unreasonable work demands, from poor wages, unhealthy working conditions, and just their lives were far worse than the people who profited off of their labor. Now, this has been the case for many years. It's going to keep happening because humans take advantage of people. That's just how we do things. It's not right. I'm just saying how it is. And another thing we have to deal with here is that alcoholism and drug addiction ran rampant in the streets as people sought a way to get some relief from the stresses of their lives. This is a very tumultuous time for them. They have very little help. They're not being engaged by the church as much as they should have. The people above them, their bosses aren't caring for them. The people around them aren't caring for them because they're angry at them for this, or they're just attacking each other instead of solving a problem together. And as a result of that, many of these people, unfortunately, would end up as addicts to their vice of choice, choosing to spend money on it rather than their own welfare. This is unfortunately a story that happens over and over again in this case alone. And it was happening before then, it was happening after then, it's happening now. So when you're thinking of this, don't just think, oh, this is a fantastical story of, a bunch of poor women that were slaughtered. It's like, no, there's a lot going on here before we get into the racial stuff that was causing a lot of strife and turmoil in these people's lives. And there were people who should have been doing their jobs well that weren't. I'm talking clergy, I'm talking police, I'm talking welfare people all over. And these people's lives suffered as a result. Now, London, during this time, had seen an influx of immigrants from many regions of the world who hoped to come there for asylum, for safety, and a place to restart. Now, naturally, unfortunately, this led many natives of the land to resent the immigrants for taking what they saw as rightfully theirs, while both sides were being taken advantage of by their superiors. So, people were coming to England from India, from Africa, from Poland, from France, from all over the place, trying to find a new life for themselves here and escape from things that were really, if they had stayed, would probably have gotten them killed, only to end up in a life that felt like hell. And also, as has been the case for the vast majority of recorded history, the Jewish citizens of the land were persecuted and ostracized, forcing them to grow insular and do business with one another more often than their Gentile neighbors, which then the Gentiles would then go, oh, well, so you're not dealing with us. So there's something secret you're doing over there I want to know about. Or maybe you're just plotting something, which would create its own self fulfilling prophecy of hatred directed towards the Jews, who would direct it back to the Gentiles. And it's all over the place. It wasn't good, simply put. And that's something that was happening at this time. It's very important in this case because it is brought up a couple of times. Like I said, because at certain points, many accusations are thrown against the Jews when Ripper killings start, saying that the killings were related to Jewish religious texts that advocated killing Christians. More than likely, I forget the exact term for this, but the idea was killing Christian children for blood sacrifices and stuff like that, which is totally against everything Judaism stands for, to the point where Rabbi Herman Adler, who, in my opinion, as I'm reading through all this, he's a big unsung hero of this case, and that he's doing everything in his power to make sure, like, look, guys, this is the actual information. Listen here. Don't listen to what people are saying. Don't give in to the mob mentality. I'm trying to keep peace between our peoples here. And some of it worked, some of it didn't, unfortunately. And he did everything he could. Like, I don't know. This is the only time I've ever encountered the man's name, so maybe he's not as virtuous as we would like him to be. But from what I see here, Herman Adler, unsung hero in this case. Now, unfortunately, perhaps one of the worst facets, I keep using that word, unfortunately, there's going to be a lot of times. It's a very unfortunate case. There's no other way around it. They were, how to put this, one of the worst facets of this case. And what we need to know to understand what's going on here that led to the killing of many women is that a lot of them were forced into prostitution either to, make ends meet, or, neither they nor their husbands were paid well enough to take care of their families. And that was if they were married. Like divorcees, unmarried women, and human trafficked slaves, both men and women, had few means to support themselves and went into prostitution due to it being a guaranteed way to make money at this time in England. So I keep using that word unfortunate. I wish there was a better word that came to mind, but it's very true. A lot of great evil was happening here. Some self-inflicted, some caused by situations, some people taking advantage of those in need and ruining their lives as a result. So that's that. It's time for us to go into the victims. That first victim, her name is Mary Ann Nichols. She, following a separation from her husband due to her alcoholism, went into prostitution in order to support her addiction. She had been seen earlier in the night on August 31st, noticeably drunk and looking for someone to pay for her services so that she could afford a room for the night. Now, in the hour between that sighting and Charles Cross finding her body, she had been slain by an unknown assailant who had brutalized her body by stabbing it multiple times, including twice in the groin. There are way worse descriptions there. I'm going to stop there. Just so you're aware, like I said earlier, I'm not going to go through all that. It's a lot. Other places will do that. I'm not going to. Now, evidence suggested it was done by a shoemaker's knife or perhaps a cork cutter, like something that someone knew what they were doing. They'd had the opportunity to work with this device before. And unlike other cases, like the escalation hadn't happened yet, no organs had been removed in this attack. So that was Mary Ann Nichols. Next up, we have Annie Chapman. Now she, on September 8th, had been discovered dead in the morning at 6 a.m. Like Mary Ann before her, Annie also suffered from alcoholism and entered prostitution in order to have enough money to survive, and she too had separated from her husband because of her dependencies. This is a classic case you're going to see all across, not just Whitechapel, but all over London, England, America, too many times. The stresses of life, the inability to find comfort, the inability to find any way to help and support oneself led to this, to where it just created this never ending cycle of people dependent on something. Some people went to opium, other hard drugs. Some people went to alcohol because it was more readily available and a little cheaper. And that's where she went. Now, Annie was found to have been slashed deeply in the throat twice, and her abdomen was mutilated with some similar precision to the weapon used in the first case, making a clear connection to the investigation at that time. So the first one, it's unfortunate to say, well, it was just another murder at the first. It's like, oh, these things happen. Oh no, those drunk idiots, they're getting killed again. Oh no, another prostitute's dead. And that was just a feeling at a time. And that's one thing you develop when you look into true crime as a premise is who are the less dans? That more often than not, the police don't do their diligence investigating and looking after. Now, it depends on where you're at. More than likely, it's going to be someone, it's going to be racially charged, or it's going to be, oh, well, they were just living in a high risk lifestyle, and therefore, well, they kind of got what they deserved. And then no one investigates, or no one cares, or at best, they may release a name and say this person existed once. And that's one thing we have to fight against. That's one reason why a lot of people get a little too uppity, going in the opposite direction of saying, oh, well, they weren't doing anything wrong and therefore they're being vilified. And it's like, no, 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 no. There were plenty of people doing wrong. That doesn't mean they should have been murdered for it, mind you. But that's where we end up. And if you're like me and you find true crime fascinating, you've got to wrestle with this and go, what could we have done differently? How could we have looked after these people that, while I don't agree and never will agree with decisions made, how can I still love and support them and their families and see them as a person created in the image of God that they are? So just a little out there. So returning back to Annie, there was, when they were doing their investigation, they found a leather apron was nearby the body, making people speculate that the killer could be a tanner or a butcher. This will come up to one of our suspects in a little bit. But it continued, oh, This is very close to that first murder. We may actually have a killer on the loose. Now, the term serial killer, as it is defined today, doesn't really exist around this time. And in fact, this is one of the serial killings that invents that trope along the way in the mind of researchers, in the mind of scientists, in the mind of police investigators, FBI, so on and so forth. So they really don't know how to handle this. Like, I know people can kill multiple people, but the actual terms that we have today is something that had to be developed over time. But before we go to our third victim, we have to go to a little letter entitled Dear Boss. And this was sent to the Central News Agency. And it says, as I'll bring up the image here, maybe you're able to see that with the red ink, maybe you won't. Dear Boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about leather apron gave me real fits. I am down on whores and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. Grand work that the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and want to start again. You will soon hear of me with my funny little games. I saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with, but it went thick like glue and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope. Ha ha. The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ear off and send to the police officers just for jolly, wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp, and I want to get to work right away if I get the chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Don't mind me giving the trade name. P.S. Wasn't good enough to post this before I got all the red ink off my hands, curse it. No luck yet. They say I'm a doctor now. Ha ha. Now, there's a lot to look at here. And there's also a lot to say is like, should we ever, publish something that a killer has done? Try to, what's the word I'm looking for here? Try to glorify it anyway. Like, that's not my intent when I'm doing this. And I understand someone who would be upset with that. But it helps us get into the psyche if this is a legitimate letter, and I have my doubts, to see what kind of person would have done this? Who would send a letter to the news and then give themselves a name? It sounds like a very entitled person, sounds like a very prideful person. If this is legitimate, and we'll get to that in a second, because there's been a lot of debate on whether or not this letter is actually from the killer. For the sake of time, it is commonly believed to be a hoax, and the second letter we'll discuss tonight is more legitimate due to the difference in the intelligence and how the writing is done, how the letters are composed. It's generally thought that the killer wasn't someone of means, it wasn't someone of, noble status or something like that. Not to say it's impossible for this to be done. And if so, it's a really good redirect from the From Hell letter we'll get to in a second. But more than likely, given their knowledge of Whitechapel, their ability to go around here and get off pretty much scot-free from what we can tell, more than likely it was a resident, which not a lot of people in that area had the schooling necessary for a lot of this, had, the ability to better themselves academically. Not to say it's impossible once again, but it's not. When you look at the vast majority of the people around you, you kind of go one way or the other. So I am of the belief this letter is not legitimate. In the 30s, I believe it was 34, I think, if I remember correctly, there was a newspaper writer or editor who said, hey, I made it up. I put it out there. Here's my proof. I think he gives similar ink or something like that. But once again, hoaxing something it's kind of hard. When you bring something out into the ether, you kind of go, can I believe it or not? And this is one of those that, unlike something like the Piltdown Man case, where it's kind of obvious it's a hoax, so you kind of go, okay, I get it. You just made this up to screw with people and, put Britain on the map that way, and anthropologically. This one doesn't feel, what's the word I'm looking for? Like it was actually given by the killer, which If that is true, that means the killer was given a name based on a falsified letter, which is interesting in its own right. However, there are counterpoints against this, in that the killer, some FBI profiling has been done. It says, okay, well, they would have had a desire to be seen, a desire for people to look at them and go, oh, they did this. They're smart. They're intelligent. They were capable of crafting this and doing these heinous things. So it is possible this could come from the killer directly and they name themselves. So regardless, we have taken the term Jack the Ripper, and the rest is history, as they say. Which will bring us to our third victim of the night, which is Elizabeth Stride. Now, several weeks later, so there was a short cool down period. That's a term you'll often see. Sometimes it goes on for years, sometimes it goes on for days or weeks or months. Is that time where it's said that the killer is like waiting a little bit to kill, they're waiting a little bit to get stuff done, or maybe they're afraid of police seeing them, or they know that they got a tail on them, so they're stopping for a bit. We don't know for sure if it is, because once again, we don't know who the killer is. I'm going to give my best guess later on as to who I think it is. No, knowing that we're not going to be able to go through every single suspect for the sake of time. Like, if I had someone else here with me, maybe, but just talking about myself, no. So Elizabeth Stride. Like I said, several weeks later, on September 30th, the body of Elizabeth Stride was discovered by Louis Schutz when his horse veered off path to avoid hitting what he thought was a bundle on the road. Earlier that evening, Elizabeth had been seen talking to a broad-shouldered man with a brown mustache and standing at around 5'5". She had denied him her body for the night, claiming she would do it another time. It was not long after this exchange that she was found murdered, as her body was still warm when examined. Her throat had been slit surgically, but not more was done to the body as it had occurred in other cases. More than likely because the killer hadn't had the time, since her body was discovered so soon after her death. There are many reports of maybe someone seeing someone fleeing the scene, or judging from when that conversation happened in between when she was found, like there wasn't enough time for Jack the Ripper to actually get the job done as he normally would have done to the other victims, which is a small mercy given to her that she wasn't seen in the other states the other women were. I mean, it doesn't really matter her either way, I suppose, given what happens to her ultimately. But here we do have what is finally a first physical description somewhat of who the killer could be. Now, this is also something we need to talk about that's going to come all over these things. It's kind of like a connecting point from cryptozoology to ufology and so on and so forth and true crime. Eyewitness testimony is one of the most infuriating things in the world, because unfortunately people want to tell the truth when they're telling these things, but they'll misremember something, or they'll think they saw something that they didn't, or an officer or an agent or someone will say, well, did you consider this? And then they'll invent something just to please the person they're talking to. Sometimes not even maliciously. They'll even imagine that it actually happened, even though earlier in their memory it didn't. So it's all over the place. Now, just not to say eyewitness testimony never matters ever. No, eyewitness testimony is one of the most important things we have in the world. But we should always temper ourselves when it shows up and go, okay, it is possible they didn't see what they saw, or they imagined something else. So just keep that in mind as thing goes on. Now for her, once again, since her body had been found so soon after her death, it was a lot easier for police and the doctors around to figure out a time of death and figure out the cause and all that. So once again, a smaller mercy, and unfortunately a crime that has never once been, in human courts at least, punished like it should have. Which brings us to our fourth victim that same night, Catherine Eddowes. Less than 1 hour after the murder of Elizabeth Stride. A second victim was discovered with her intestines outside her body and was further disemboweled with medical precision. Earlier that night, Catherine had been jailed temporarily for public intoxication and had been let out once she had sobered up a bit. This is typical. I don't know if it's still the case today with police officers. Is you get that, okay, you're obviously publicly drunk. We'll put you in for a little bit. We're not going to jail you permanently. Just wait for you to sober up, then get you out of here. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. This would be one of those where it didn't work, unfortunately. And due to her intoxication, it's more than likely believed she wasn't able to fight off her assailant or do anything that could have helped her ultimately to find someone to get her out of it. So she became our fourth victim. Now, this is something I forgot to say earlier. I should have mentioned. These are known as the 5 canonical victims of Jack the Ripper. There are others. There's a case from before this happens we think may have been a proto case. There's about 3 or 4 others that take place in a span after 1888. There you go. Maybe they're involved. But when you're researching this, typically people go and have these 5 cases. This is the 4th one so far. We're going to get to the 5th one after we get to the From Hell letter. And say, for sure, these were committed by the same person. The vast majority of researchers are going to say yes to that. Other people, it's all over the place. So that's one of the most infuriating parts of this. Number one, we don't have an identity for the killer. Number two, we can't figure out which ones were actually done by him outside of possibly just these 5. So keep that in mind. So in the midst of the police investigation there for Catherine Eddowes, they found some graffiti nearby. Now, this is something they don't know. Did the killer write this? Was it graffiti done by someone else? It seems to point to the killer being the one doing this as a way of maybe heightening racial tensions. When it says it's very unpleasant, so I'll probably skip ahead like 30 seconds. It says, the Jews, misspelled by the way, are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. Now, it doesn't sound like the most terrible thing in the world if you're just hearing it, but knowing the racial tensions at the time, knowing what was going on, this is clearly done in a way to either implicate the person as a Jewish graffiti artist who says, hey, we're always going to get away with what we do, or it's someone who says, oh, the police aren't doing their jobs. They should take them down. All the Jews are out there doing these things and like they're Jack the Ripper or they're, taking our jobs from us and stuff like that. So why aren't they, protecting us? It can be taken either way. I think it's the latter in these options. And what it caused is uproar. And if you remember Rabbi Adler earlier, this is one of the reasons he had to write that article to say, like, look, hey, this is not what we're about. This has nothing to do with Judaism. Like, and he didn't throw shade, but I'll throw shade on his behalf. If these people knew better, if they actually went to church like they were saying they were doing, they would know, oh, wait, oh, so the Old Testament, oh, that's what they believe in. Oh, duh. And then they'd know, oh, this has nothing to do with anything God ever said to do. So it's upsetting immensely. And it certainly didn't help the investigation. Now, even worse, if the killer was actually Jewish, which is a possibility, it doesn't help the case and be like, oh, see, we were right. Yep, that's exactly what we said would happen. Versus, like, you always hate when that happens. It's like, wrong is you right for the wrong reasons. One of the most terrible things that happens in cases across the world. But ignoring that for a little bit, we're going to stop for a moment and consider the letter sent to George Lusk of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee that kind of had been formed as like a response to all this. I think there had been members before that. But it's really like people trying to look out for people. It's like, hey, there's a killer on the loose. We can't let this be happening in our neighborhood, in this district of Whitechapel. So this letter is entitled From Hell. And it says, From hell, Mr. Lusk. Sore. Probably meant to say sir, but given the rest of this. I should say this is clearly a lot of misspellings here, so I would try to read it as accurately as possible. And it's one of the reasons why I think this is actually real, but we'll get to that in a second. Soar. I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you. T'other piece I fried and ate it was very nice. I may send you the bloody nif that took it out if you only wait a while longer. Signed, Catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk. Now, that is, if I remember correctly, the origination of that phrase. Catch me if you can. Now, when we look at this situation, there was a preserved kidney, half of one at least, that the writer claimed to eat in the other half. That was brought there. So you're very Hannibal there. This was clearly one of the things that Harris was thinking of when making that. So why is this letter legitimate in most people's eyes and in my eyes versus the other one? Well, it depends on who you're asking. Now, me, I think it's because, once again, this is written by someone who does fit that profile we mentioned earlier that wants to be like seen as this person doing these heinous things. They're getting away with it, and they're messing with police. They're messing with the people trying to find them in this vigilante group here. But they showcase that obviously they don't know the language as better as other people, which would tend to head towards someone who may have just recently arrived there, an immigrant who didn't know English that well. And I completely sympathize with anyone who has to learn this language for the first time after there are far better languages out there. That this language is abysmal. I am so sorry. I feel you 100%. So that's not me mocking them for being, low intelligence or anything like that. It's like, given what we had around the time, chances are they didn't know the language that well. Maybe they knew how to speak. Maybe they didn't know how to write it well. And this would lead to some of the case suspects we have along the way. So that's why I think it is. There's also some cases against it, and that, the knife, there is a K in it, if you can see that. And you wouldn't know that unless you knew, oh, the K is silent. So some people think this was deliberate what's the word I'm looking for? Deliberate misdirection, and say, oh, I'll make them think it's some poor yokel who's doing this and it's not me, this clearly smarter person, blah, blah, blah. So that is something against the idea. So I will send that out there for you to think about. Not because I have my biases here. Like my one of my primary sources here is Jack the Ripper and the case for Scotland Yard's prime suspect. Is written by Robert House. I think he did a really great job with it, but he is clear and he has a bias that he wants his killer to be the one killer, and I do ultimately agree with him as we get there eventually. It's still a bias. We still don't know for sure. So I'm telling you that just to be aware. Hey, I have my own biases. I'm doing my best not to, but there you go. Now, from there, we go to our last victim of the canonical five, Mary Jane Kelly. After cries of murder had been heard, but not reported during the hours before sunrise on November 9th, the body of Mary Jane Kelly was discovered in the morning inside her home when her landlord sent someone to retrieve her rent. Now, you may notice we have almost a month and a half, a little less than that gap. So another cool down period here, like assuming that there were no other murders to be found. So just recognize that fact. No one had seen anyone enter her home, but someone had been heard leaving around 5:45 a.m., hours after Mary Jane had been murdered. Given that the killer had more time to handle this corpse, he took his time with her, undressing the body, removing the liver, intestine, kidneys, and other organs, and displaying the body to be found in a very humiliating fashion. It's something you're also going to see. Many serial killers out there love humiliating their victims, showing their superiority over them, especially, chances are if they have a very misogynistic streak, this is showing their ability to show, I'm so much better than you poor woman. Yeah, look at me. It's very terrible stuff. Don't recommend. But that's how they found it. And this is where the canonical killings stop. Now, like I said earlier, there are possibly more, that could be attributed to Jack the Ripper, but for the sake of time, we'll end with these and go to suspects. So, first up on our docket will be John Pizer. And if I mispronounce any of these names, I should have said that earlier. I apologize. It's not my intent. Now, if you remember from one of the earlier cases, a leather apron had been left at one of the crime scenes. And the fact that he no longer had one of his made Pizer a suspect. He was brought in for questioning early on by the police. However, after much interrogation, they ruled him out as a suspect, as there was nothing but circumstantial evidence to suggest his involvement. Like that apron itself didn't really belong to him, if I remember correctly. But that's something we need to bring up to him that affects some of our other cases, suspects here, at least the ones I'm bringing up tonight. That Pizer himself was a Polish Jew who, like others on this list, had immigrated to England to escape persecution following a failed rebellion in Russian controlled Poland earlier in the decade, and was a bootmaker by trade. Now, this happened, Russia took over Poland in the 1800s, and Europe was never a nice place for any Jewish person, to be perfectly honest with you, but they made it a lot worse. And a lot of the Jews were seen as being backers of this rebellion, so the Russians were persecuting them, taking away their synagogues and not allowing them to worship or anything like that. So a lot of them fled away to England, which was better. They were allowed to practice their religion. They were allowed to get jobs and look after one another, but the people were very hostile towards them. They saw these, immigrants as leeches, taking jobs away from them. They didn't like that it didn't speak the language that well. So this is one reason why, if the suspect was a Polish Jew, which chances are it was, it kind of brings up that whole thing of I hate proving those people. Well, you're not proving them right. That's a terrible way to put that. But they think they're going to be proven right because of what actually happened. So I want to be mindful of that as I do throw my accusations later on. Now, going back to good old John here, he was believed to have been involved with assaults on prostitutes, but had nothing in that had ever been proven. And most believe he had nothing to do with the murders. Like one of the officers that took him in actually knew him and said, "Hey, like he's a piece of trash." No, in my professional opinion, but I don't think he did this. So most people kind of they'll put him on the list and say, "Hey, there was circumstantial evidence." This is how you look at someone who could potentially be a killer, but isn't. So don't look at the circumstantial. Look at the actual evidence. There you go. Now, next up, I don't have a picture of this person because no photo exists as far as I am aware. But we go to Aaron Kosminski. Aaron is one of the most likely candidates for who Jack the Ripper actually is. And he himself was another Polish Jewish man who worked as a barber and hairdresser after joining his family in England. By escaping persecution in his homeland, he suffered, unfortunately, from mental illness and was known to suffer mad fits from time to time. And he himself has been documented having a very low opinion of women due to the very casual sexual environment he saw around him. That was very blatant back then. There were, was it like 62 brothels, I think, were active at that time. So, like, sure, the law of the land was no, you shouldn't be doing this, but people being people, they wanted something and they got it. Now, in 1891, he even threatened his own sister with a knife and was committed to a mental institution. However, recall that the canonical killing stopped in 1888, meaning we have a 3-year interval of inactivity if this is the case. But if his cool down period was done, if he had gotten his satisfaction, he could have just stopped. Like we know for sure, like the BTK killer, like had like a very long period where he just stopped. He had gotten his jollies off then, and then the idiot gave him up to the police, thank God, thinking he was being so smart. So they got some DNA off and finally figured out who he is. And that's definitely one we'll add to the list of potential ones we'll talk about later. So it is possible for someone to kill, stop and then stop, even permanently. They've gotten what they needed to get done. But also, we see in a memo written by Melville McNaughton, who served as the assistant chief constable of the London Metro Police, Kosminski, was named as a suspect, and Chief Inspector Donald Swanson also named him as their primary suspect. But they both cited not having enough evidence to convict him. They had him under surveillance and noted his hatred of women and homicidal tendencies. However, they never saw him doing anything that would say, you were there, and never had an eyewitness say, like, he was there on the scene of the crime, killed this woman. So, in what is, so I'm looking for here. Oh, gosh. What is, at the time, very good is that even when the pressure is on them, saying, we need to find a killer, you need to find a killer, you need to get this done, the police didn't make a scapegoat out of anyone when they could have easily done it and said, this is our guy. Any other killings happen after this, someone else. They didn't do that. So they had like next to no evidence on this guy. They for sure thought it was him. A lot of people did. And another one on this list they do too. But this one they think more. But they just didn't have enough, and no one planted evidence. There was no being a dirty cop there. And this is a time when there were plenty around there. Not all of them, but there was enough that could have been, swept under the rug and said, oh, this is our guy. He was always him. And they could have said, look, we did our job. But no, they actually looked like a bunch of fools, which, given the time period and given, crime scene investigation, I don't blame them a lot when it comes to that. Now, when it comes to handling some of the suspects they had, some of the racially charged words they used there, obviously not a big fan of that. But they were just dealing with what they had. So it's a very convoluted situation. You can't just go, well, they were incompetent and then leave it at that. Like, no, there was definitely incompetence done. But it's not their fault. They lived in a time when they weren't able to solve things that we can do now and go, oh, well, there's one hair left behind by the perpetrator. Oh, well, we've got him. He's in the system. We're good. So give a little grace, but don't extend all of it, is how I'll put it that way. Now, next up, we have Serwin Klozowski, also known as George Chapman. Now, it was another thing that immigrants would do back in the day is they would take on a more anglicized name or a biblical name. That way they would fit in a little more into British society. So what George Chapman did here, he too immigrated to England to escape persecution and was well known to the police later on, especially for poisoning 3 of his wives, and was eventually hung for this in 1903. You will recognize that fact as being 15 years after the 5th canonical murder. Now, Inspector Frederick Aberline, in opposition to his fellows of Scotland Yard, had always suspected him of the crimes, and when he was convicted for the murder of his wives, tried to get the Ripper crimes added to the list of convictions based on his own conviction rather than any actual evidence. Now, Chapman was a well-known misogynist, and this hatred of women was easily seen in the murder of his wives, done so casually. But others believe he let out his abuses onto the victims in the Jack the Ripper case as well, as he was a well-regarded surgeon, and the preciseness of the cuts and incisions in the victims made some investigators believe that only someone with immense medical knowledge could have made them. However, he didn't leave London until 1891, so just like Kosminski before, this leaves 3 years with no activity if this was the case. But also recall that it is possible for a killer for their cooldown to stop and just be done. Now, this doesn't make sense to them at that time because, well, they don't have all the years of forensic evidence that we do, of criminal profiles that we do. So they thought, well, surely either the killer was dead or committed suicide or something like that. So the killer's gone, except for this person we think it is. And the reason it stopped is because he went to a mental institution or he left, England or what have you. So where does that leave us? Well, if I haven't let it slip, with the evidence presented so far, and due to the police's strong belief that he perpetrated the crimes, but also due to the fact that they didn't have enough evidence to convict him, I say that Jack the Ripper was Aaron Kosminski. Now, I have not made this study my life. There are people who have done this way longer than me to come to very different conclusions. There are other people on that list who I didn't mention. Just for the sake of time, like we're already 46 minutes right here. We could have easily gone on for an hour or more just by listing different suspects. Lewis Carroll was actually a suspect. He of Alice in Wonderland fame. Now, that's more than likely not true, but he's on the suspect list. But that's where I draw my conclusions here. I think it's Kosminski. I think it's, his noted hatred of women. I hated seeing the casual sex in that system around him. He hated being treated differently just because he was an immigrant. He took out his aggressions on women, killed those five, wanted them to be humiliated, wanted them to be seen like that. So that's where I find my answer. Now, I'm actually curious what you guys think. So please leave a comment below. Say that, hey, I think it's this person I didn't list, or it's one of the other killers I list. Excuse me, suspects, I should say. And say, here's my reasons why. Here's my reasons why I don't think it's Kosminski. I'm all for that. Please let me know. And with that, what do you believe, dear listeners and viewers? Who was the real Jack the Ripper? Was it one of the candidates spoken of tonight or someone else? We didn't touch everything that history and folklore have on this subject tonight, so let us know in the comments below if there's something else you'd like us to do a follow-up on. In the description below, you can find the sources used for tonight's program. Next time in December, we will be moving on to our next category, ufology, which I am super excited about. Well, we will be discussing the Betty and Barney Hill abduction and whether or not it happened at all. And after that is done, we'll go back to the top of the list in cryptozoology. If you want to know what's happening next, you should be voting on Facebook at the Priest of the Geeks page, which helps decide which one of these we'll be doing month after month. So thank you all for voting. Thank you all for heading out here. But remember, we are all a chosen people, a geekdom of priests.